Hello, and welcome to SETI Live. I'm your host, Beth Johnson, Communications Specialist here at the SETI Institute. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us from around the world. Let us know where you are watching from. And welcome to our listeners on the podcast version of SETI Live, available on most podcast platforms. Today, I have the joy, this is our last SETI Live of the year, and I am joined by Rebecca Charbonneau, who is a historian with the American Institute of Physics and whose latest book, or whose first book, I believe, called Mixed Signals, is coming out here in the US next month and is already out in the UK. And it is basically a look at, and this is so fascinating to me. It is a look at the Cold War relationship between the US and the USSR and what it meant for radio astronomy and how it affected the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So it is literally right up our alley. And I am so pleased to be joined today. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's so fun to chat.
It is so good. It's so nice to meet you. Like we've kind of known each other online for a long time. So this is another one of those, yay, more science communicators to get to know. So the US and the USSR, this is kind of a big deal. Like this was a massive thing. Obviously, I'm Gen X, so the Cold War is very much the backdrop of my youth. What inspired you to take a run at this topic?
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned it being the backdrop of your youth. So I'm a millennial, and I'm a young millennial on that. But I was still kind of inspired by my childhood as well. My family is from Cuba, and I grew up in Miami, Florida. So there was definitely the backdrop of the Cold War influenced my childhood. My family fled the communist revolution in Cuba in the 50s and 60s. And, I also grew up in Florida, which is, not too far away from the space coast where the space race, unfolded. And so there, that was very much, again, just kind of the backdrop of my childhood. So I was always really fascinated with space and with the Cold War. But I didn't really get into the topics from an academic capacity until I was doing my graduate education at the University of Oxford, where I was writing a dissertation on the history of the space race and on the Cold War. And I found this book that was written by Carl Sagan and a Soviet astrophysicist, Joseph Shklovsky, on the idea of intelligent life in the universe. And actually that was the name of the book, Intelligent Life in the Universe. And it was published in 1966. And I just thought it was so weird that there was here, on the shelves of the library at Oxford, this book written by an American and a Soviet, kind of at the height of the Cold War and the space race.
Right.
But like on this topic of searching for extraterrestrial life in the universe. And it got me thinking, like, how did this book get written? Like, what would it have taken for a Soviet and American to work together on a subject like that during that time period? And that sent me down a rabbit hole that ended up turning into my entire master's and then PhD dissertation, and then now my book as well.
That is fantastic. I had no idea about that book, so I'm gonna have to hunt that one down. I'm gonna welcome.
It's one of the few Sagan books that's out of print, but you can actually find really old copies of it on like Amazon or used bookstores.
I'm sort of surprised that it's not on my parents' bookshelf, and I'll get to that in just a second. But I want to welcome people in from where they're watching. Someone is watching from Mars. Thank you. Enjoy the robots that we have sent. We have someone watching from London, from Scotland, Istanbul. I saw New Jersey. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Very excited to have you all here. Connecticut. Rebecca, I have to admit to a couple of things here. One, my father was an Air Force pilot.
Oh, nice.
And he was stationed at Homestead at one point. So I actually did my time on the Space Coast. And there,
nice.
There was a lot, a lot of things going on, obviously. And so Miami definitely, we'll trade Miami stories at some other point in time, because I do have them. I was very young, but I still have them. And anyway, what was sort of like the most interesting? Let me back myself up. You cover sort of what you call like three separate periods in this book.
Yeah.
And one of the cool things is that like I have not actually seen the CETI abbreviation. And so like I was fascinated to see that we have that you started with that and that there was a difference.
Oh, yeah.
So can you explain for our audience what CETI is? It's still pronounced SETI, so obviously no confusion there. But what is it, and what's the distinction between that and SETI?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And yeah, it is. I actually really struggled with this with my book because SETI with a C or SETI with an S sound the same. And it's difficult to go back and forth between the two. But as I make the case in the book, they're actually really pretty distinct phenomena. So SETI with a C, so CETI, stands for Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is a little bit different in how we normally talk about SETI, which today is primarily with an S, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. But as I found in my research, when you first begin to look at the really early history of SETI as a discipline, the term SETI with an S was really not used. So in the period of the kind of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even into the early 80s, the predominant term was SETI with a C. And I found this to be really interesting because so again, SETI started developing kind of in the late 1950s, early 1960s with the Morrison and Cocconi paper, with Frank Drake's Project Ozma in 1960. And it happened both in the United States and the Soviet Union. And I found the emphasis on C for communication really fascinating because you have these groups of scientists in these two respective countries who are interested in the idea of not just seeking out life in the universe, but communicating with it. And at the same time, they were trying to communicate with one another across the Iron Curtain, facing a lot of communication difficulties here on Earth. So there's this really delightful parallel between what these scientists are doing in a scientific capacity with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, with the idea of how do we communicate with alien beings, at the same time as they're really struggling with communication here with their scientific colleagues here on Earth. And again, this is you can't take this away from the history of SETI. It's one of the key parts of its early development. And so I'm trying to bring the C in SETI back. I think our historical memory is short. We really think of SETI as being as SETI with an S. But I just want to remind everyone from a historical viewpoint, SETI with an S is a kind of relatively recent phenomena. And our roots are in SETI with a C.
That's interesting. So we just celebrated, and I'm sure you've kind of noticed, but we just celebrated the SETI Institute's 40th anniversary last month. So obviously that kind of ties into a similar timeline that, the Institute is founded kind of at that same point where the name is changing. So that's really interesting that I think there is it seems like there might be, I don't think it's coincidental. And then I love the fact that in your introduction, like just in your introduction, you get Carl Sagan, you get Frank Drake, and you get Jill Tarter. And I was just sort of like, yeah, see, this is for us. This is what we are here for.
Yeah.
So what are some of the difficulties in getting this Cold War relationship to get them to talk to each other and work together? How did this work, and why was radio astronomy sort of the joining force?
Yeah, so it was very difficult. And actually, this is why I think, as a Cold War historian, as a historian of astronomy and science, I think that SETI is one of the most fascinating and kind of underlooked at areas of the history of science, because it really tells us a lot about the historical environment in which it grew out of. This is because radio astronomy as a discipline really developed at the end of World War II out of radar infrastructure that was used in the war. So in some ways, it was really born out of a wartime environment. And a lot of the early radio astronomers who developed the science into a proper discipline after the war had in fact been radar operators during World War II. And so these were former soldiers. And then to make matters even more tied to warfare, at the end of World War II, start of the Cold War, you start seeing radio astronomy infrastructure being used for things like space telemetry, space tracking, signals intelligence, nuclear launch and defense systems. It becomes just so tied into the landscape of national defense for both the Soviet Union and the United States. But then on the other hand, it's also this thriving new discipline where a lot of the scientists involved have this really apolitical approach to science. They think that science shouldn't have borders, especially astronomical science, because it has such this backdrop of universality that we're learning about, not national interests, but truly universal ones. And so there is that internationalist vein that runs through the science that caused scientists to want to work with one another. And then, of course, there's just the practical standpoint, which is that radio astronomy at this point in time is largely, exclusively ground-based for the most part, and the Earth moves. So if you want to look at things like transient astronomical objects, if you want to, for example, find a signal that's coming from another world, if you want to maintain constant observation, you need to work with your colleagues across the globe. And there's so many instances in the history of astronomy where working with your colleagues on other sides of the planet is incredibly useful to the science. So you have this tie between warfare, but then internationalism, right? This idea that science is apolitical, the idea that we're not just Americans or Soviets trying to contact other worlds, we're Earthlings. So it has this really unifying vein that runs through it. And then also just a practical standpoint that incentivizes scientists to want to work together. And so you get a little bit of this clash between the kind of warfare, national security side of the infrastructure that's being used. And then again, this very unity-filled, optimistic mentality that did push these scientists to try to work with one another, even though there were huge barriers. Because it's, if you want to work with your colleagues in the Soviet Union and you want to share infrastructure, but that infrastructure is also being used to combat against the nation your colleague is from, that is a tremendously difficult thing to do.
Especially given that, the 50s, of course, saw the real advent of the space race, with Sputnik and that sort of thing. And then just the whole, okay, we're up against them. It was very much an us against them mentality.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm kind of amazed that this actually worked. So I'm going to welcome in some more people, and I'm loving some of the commentary that's going on. So this is great. Let's see, we have Netherlands, Ireland, Finland. Let's see, Niagara Falls, New York, Kansas City, Southern Italy. Wow, I'm all over. And from New Jersey. They're airplanes. I'm just going to say it right now. They're airplanes. All right, let it go.
I'm a historian of astronomy. I only care about things that happen outside the atmosphere.
Exactly. And the drones are airplanes. Like that's just basically, yeah. So and California. Okay. All right. So how did it start? How did you mentioned the Carl Sagan book, but how did this actually start? Where did it begin?
So in terms of the collaboration between Carl Sagan played a really big role in establishing the collaborations between the Soviet SETI community and the American SETI community. That being said, it actually started a little bit earlier with Project Ozma and the Philip Morrison and Giuseppe Cocconi paper published in 1959, which we generally consider, for those of you who aren't familiar, we generally consider to be the first published SETI article in a scientific journal. So in some ways, formally launched the field as a scientific, subdiscipline. And that's because both Morrison and Cocconi's paper and Frank Drake's Project Ozma either proposed using or actually used, in Drake's case, the 21 centimeter hydrogen line as the place in which we were going to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's a little bit funny why they chose that frequency. And partly it's because that frequency was really important to radio astronomy, because hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. It's a very important frequency for radio astronomers to study. And the thinking is that if there are radio astronomers on other worlds, they're also going to be looking at the hydrogen line. And so that's the most obvious place to put a message if you were going to put a message somewhere. And so Joseph Shklovsky, who was the Soviet astrophysicist I mentioned earlier, he actually played an important role in calculating the transition of neutral hydrogen, the 21 centimeter hydrogen line, in Soviet science. And he also had helped establish radio astronomy as a discipline in the Soviet Union. And so when he first found out about Project Ozma, he was super excited that this line that he had helped make part of the landscape of radio astronomy in the Soviet Union had this special new purpose. He became extremely excited by that. And he ended up writing a book called Universe Life Mind, Vysyelenaya Жизнь Разум in Russian. And it was published in 1962. And it was essentially the Russian version of what would later become Intelligent Life in the Universe. It was this book that was, in some sense, a popular astronomy textbook, but then, introducing some of Shklovsky's ideas on intelligent life in the universe, ranging from, the somewhat reasonable, what would it mean to have life on other worlds? How might we go about contacting them? To some of his little more quirky theories. For example, he thought because of the irregularities in the orbit of Phobos around Mars, that it might be hollow and therefore potentially an artificial satellite placed there by extraterrestrials. We now know, of course, that Phobos is porous, not hollow, and that density is why it has that strange orbit. But this book was filled with a menagerie of his ideas on extraterrestrial life. Now, a very young Carl Sagan, he was in his late 20s. He was a postdoc at Berkeley. He had just been invited in 1961 to the Green Bank Observatory in West Virginia for this kind of first ever SETI conference that happened there, hosted by the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. This is the conference in which Frank Drake first introduced the Drake equation. And
cocktail napkin science for the win.
Yeah, exactly. And so Carl Sagan, he was a young kid. He was actually invited because his advisor had been invited, and he was just filled with this excitement about the idea of there being a scientific way to study extraterrestrial life. And he had heard about Shklovsky's book, but he couldn't read it because he didn't speak Russian. So he wrote to Shklovsky and said, "Well, I'd love to get your book translated into English in the United States." And Shklovsky was super excited about this. He loved the idea of his book being translated and reaching a greater audience. And in fact, he thought that Sagan was a biologist because of Sagan's early role in doing some planetary science. It was a little bit of a miscommunication. And because of that, he told Sagan, well, why don't you add to the biology sections of the book, because he actually hadn't been able to do very much in that realm because of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union. He didn't have access to a lot of the biology texts he needed in order to write what would have been kind of like the proto-astrobiological aspects of this book. So Sagan, again, punky postdoc, took this invitation a little too literally. He ended up addending the book so much so that it doubled in size. And when the English translation was made, he sent it back to Shklovsky with his name also on the front cover of the book. And I always just think this is hilarious as someone who used to be a postdoc in her late 20s, just the sheer cheek of taking a senior scientist's book and adding so much to it so it's twice in size and adding your own name to the cover. And this could have gone horribly wrong for Carl. But it ended up, Shklovsky had a great sense of humor, and he was, again, just super enthusiastic about this new area of science that didn't bother him. He took it in stride, and that's the book. That's Intelligent Life in the Universe. And that book really helped to launch the collaboration between Soviet and American scientists during the Cold War period.
That is, you're teaching me things right here. And I've worked for the Institute for almost a decade, so this is wild. So someone has asked in the chat, and I think it's kind of an important question, simply because, like, I said, as I pointed out at the beginning, the Cold War was the backdrop of my youth. We literally had like the nuclear threat, duck and cover things going on. But there's a much younger audience going on. So Jesus is asking if you can explain what the Iron Curtain is, because that is in your title, you're trying to do this across the Iron Curtain. So what is the Iron Curtain, just so that we have some background information?
Absolutely. So the Iron Curtain is a phrase that actually comes from Winston Churchill, he was the Prime Minister of England during World War II. And it comes from a speech that he gave right at the end of World War II, in which he basically was foreseeing what was to come, the coming Cold War between, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union, but of course, the US and the UK famously had the special relationship. And he was seeing the writing on the wall, and he described the growing tension between Eastern Europe and the Western powers as an iron curtain that has fallen across Europe. And that's the phrase he used. And so historians, when we use that phrase today, we're describing the barriers between the Eastern Bloc and the Western superpowers. And it was not a physical curtain. It was a physical barrier in Germany, between East Germany and West Germany. There was famously a wall. But it's really a metaphorical term that helps us understand all the various censorships, challenges, barriers, and tensions between those two cultural entities during the Cold War period. I use it as, again, a little bit of a play in my book, just because there's the barrier of the expanse of space, which makes it difficult for us to contact, beings that may be on other worlds. But there are just as many challenges to communicating with the other beings here on our own planet.
That's very true. One of the things that I was going to talk about a little bit for me personally was when my dad left the Air Force, he went into the defense industry, as a lot of former Air Force officers did. And he ended up working for Martin Marietta and was doing defense contracting, rockets and things like that. And definitely had the clearance that, not allowed to cross those lines. And my father actually took Russian, like that was one of his big things. And he really wanted to go to the Soviet Union, really wanted to do this. And of course was not allowed to. And neither was I. My senior year in high school, our class trip was actually going to be to Moscow, and my father had to sadly inform me that I was not going to be allowed to go on that trip.
Yeah.
Because of his clearance. So, even into the early 90s, this was still a problem. And a friend of mine was actually there when the Soviet Union started to fall. Yeah. And as a young scientist herself, and so this is a big challenge, even up to when things started to fall apart.
And it still is, even to this day. But again, that the individual relationships we can form with our colleagues across any cultural barrier can make a meaningful difference. Like, it's amazing that your father, tried to learn Russian. I actually had the privilege a few years ago, maybe it's more than a few years ago now, but I was on a panel at a conference at the Green Bank Observatory with Frank Drake. Both of us were sat on the same panel. That was very exciting to me. I was a graduate student at the time, so the idea of sitting on a panel with Frank was quite thrilling. And I was having a chat with him after our panel was over, and I had been, of course, talking about my research into Soviet history and Soviet SETI. And Frank just broke into Russian with me. And we started talking in Russian. And I remember I talked to his daughter afterwards, and she was like, I didn't even know my dad spoke Russian. It's just remarkable that people, like scientists like Frank Drake, took the time to learn Russian. Because again, even though we think of Frank as being someone who had this great lifelong preoccupation with communicating with aliens, with extraterrestrials, he in some ways had just as big of a preoccupation with communicating with his fellow Earthlings, right? And he put in the time and effort to develop those language skills, to reach out across the Iron Curtain and form those connections. Because yeah, it is really difficult. It was difficult. It's still difficult now. When I flew to Moscow for my research, I happened to do it at the best possible time. It was kind of pre-pandemic, Ukraine war. And even still, it was scary. It was hard. There were all kind of barriers to doing this kind of research. I wasn't allowed into certain archives because of being American. So I think we need to, when we're talking about this history, we have to recognize not only the immense barriers, but the bravery of people like Frank, who recognized the importance of forming those connections, and did so even in the face of really serious challenges.
So speaking of challenges, what for you was the most challenging part of writing or researching this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was great. I feel I can't complain because it's just the dream, being able to work my life career as a historian of astronomy, being able to conduct oral history interviews with amazing scientists who have contributed so much to our world, and to spend my days writing about it. Really can't complain. I will say, I guess the biggest challenge was just trying to conduct the research into the Russian side of the history. For one thing, being an American, speaking English as one of my native languages, that was not too difficult. I actually happened to have a position working at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory when I was writing much of the book. They actually have an archive in the first floor of their building that has so many papers like from US SETI conferences, from the Green Bank conference in 1961. They actually have the logbook from the 85-foot telescope that Frank conducted Project Ozma in. You can see his handwriting for like Ozma for logging his telescope time. So that was kind of easy. To be honest, the history was all just there waiting for me to discover it and to write about it. The Soviet side was much more difficult because, for one thing, there are not as many formal archives in Russia. And the archives that do exist, they're frequently not welcoming to American researchers, and in many cases not welcoming to Russian researchers either. Many of them are closed archives. And then of course there is the language barrier. I had to learn Russian over the course of my graduate career. I'm still quite bad at it, but I can get by. And I conducted oral history interviews. That was my way of getting around things. Was sitting down with former Soviet scientists who had lived through it, worked in SETI in the Soviet Union, and then trying where I could to verify their oral testimony with documentary evidence. Because of course, as historians, we can't just take people at their word.
Right.
We are an empirical social science, and so we can't just write whatever we want. And so that was challenging. I spent a lot of time looking at old copies of Pravda, trying to determine whether or not the radio astronomy telescope they sent into space was actually a radio telescope, or was it a spy satellite? Or I'm trying to read between the lines of Russian Soviet history was a real challenge. I had to rely strongly. It kind of felt like I was living through what I was writing about. I had to rely on a lot of friendships and collaborations I made with Russian scientists and with Russian historians who helped me tremendously kind of navigate that system. And so there's just levels of connection here where, I was working with my colleagues across, the US-Russian divide as I was writing about scientists who were working against the Soviet and American divide, who were trying to, fight the divide of outer space to communicate with extraterrestrials and create a cosmopolitan universe. And so it was very special being able to do the research for this book.
It's a very meta themed book. It's sort of layers within layers of communication and division, and I really appreciated that, just sort of even from what I got to read of it so far. There was just so much that was going on. There's some really good audience questions coming in. So just again, to reiterate to the audience, if you have questions for Rebecca, please put them in the chat. We are checking them and we are going to be asking some of them. I want to read the whole book. Like I unfortunately ran out of time. It is a very busy time of year. But I want to read the whole thing because I just was getting very fascinated, and I'm definitely taking this home to my dad because I'm pretty sure he's gonna enjoy it as well. So I do want to welcome someone in. Someone is watching from Kosovo, so thank you for joining in. Okay, let's get to some of these audience questions.
Sure.
Okay, we have a lot, and I want to see where we can start. So let's talk about. I want to ask this as well because you brought it up and it was a term I wasn't familiar with. So Van Morgan is asking if you could talk a little about Lysenkoism. It wasn't a term I recognized. I think I know what you're talking about, but can you sort of give us the explain it like I'm five.
Sure,
explanation.
So Lysenko was the name of a biologist who worked in the Soviet Union in the kind of the Stalin days of the Soviet Union, so the earlier part. And he had a Lamarckian perspective on evolution. So to put that a little bit more simply, essentially it was this idea that there were inherited characteristics. So take, for example, giraffes. A Lamarckian interpretation of how giraffes would have evolved is that, one generation, a giraffe stretched its neck to try to reach the highest leaves, but couldn't quite, but it spent its whole life stretching. And its child would have had a little bit of a longer neck, and so on and so on and so on until you have a very long-necked creature. Now, we know that that's not how evolution works. I'm putting this very, very simply for the sake of time. And so Lysenko had a inherited characteristics of a Lamarckian interpretation of biology, of evolution, and he applied that to agriculture. And in part, Lysenko's kind of views on agriculture became kind of state mandated by Stalin's regime, and caused a lot of problems. It actually is part of what contributed to the famine that struck the Soviet Union during Stalin's regime. And it's kind of used as a case study in the history of science now as an example of like what goes wrong when pseudoscience becomes state mandated. Because there were plenty of, reasonable scientists who disagreed with Lysenko's interpretation of biology, but it didn't matter. There was not a free and open discourse in the scientific community. And scientists who went against Lysenko often faced really serious consequences. At some points, there was even, like banishments, disappearances, all the kind of stuff you tend to hear about the Stalinists.
Well, welcome to Siberia. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, here's the gulag. And so this was, by the time Shklovsky was writing Universe, Life, Mind, Lysenkoism was on its way out, which allowed him to kind of toe the line. But it was a very, very serious issue in the Soviet Union, in the period that predated Shklovsky's book.
And relates back to your book again as a communication issue. Like, how do we communicate science when we're not allowed to communicate science?
Absolutely. And that's been something I've really focused on in my career as a historian of science is, we tend to think of science as the act of doing science, of conducting experiments, of conducting observations, but ask any scientist and, they'll tell you that actually a lot of the job of a scientist is just navigating the world, right? Applying for funding, working with your collaborators, navigating political challenges, navigating interpersonal challenges. People are annoying and like it can be difficult, right? And so, and that's what I'm trying to bring attention to, especially in SETI, because in so many ways, SETI is this highly, highly interdisciplinary pursuit because it's not just about the act of conducting astronomical observations, but thinking big picture questions about, what is life? What is intelligence? How do we identify it? What even is communication or language? How do civilizations structure themselves? Like all these big picture questions that, astrophysics alone cannot answer. And rely so much on people being able to collaborate and communicate with one another, and also so highly influenced by the world and environment in which we're in, which is another argument I make in the book, that the Cold War environment shaped how the character of SETI. That's why you have the L, right, in the Drake equation for longevity of civilizations, because they were working with their Soviet counterparts during a time period in which it really felt like technological civilizations might destroy themselves because of nuclear warfare or other means. And so it's a science that is so highly affected by the context in which it operates in. And the point I'm trying to make is that that's not a bad thing. Actually, from a historical perspective, we learn so much by looking at that context about the nature of science, which is also really cool.
It's a very overarching topic. I kind of like when you start talking about the concept of pseudoscience and how even today SETI can be seen sort of like by a lot of people as that fringe science. Jill Tarter definitely talks about how her career was impacted because she chose to go into this field, and a lot of people looked at her and said, that's not job security at all. Like, that's a terrible idea. Stick with astrophysics. It's, you're going to be looked at. And one of the reasons that the SETI Institute was founded was because funding was cut off, and we wanted a place for our scientists to work. And a lot of what we do is not the radio astronomy aspects of it. A lot of it has, branched off into planetary science and planetary defense and astrobiology.
Yeah.
But all of these things have come about as a result of basically what your book talks about, this collaboration across the Iron Curtain to actually bring all of these aspects of science and these bigger picture questions sort of into view.
It's even braver when you think about it, the pioneers, early pioneers of SETI, when you consider that at that point in time, we didn't even know that exoplanets existed.
Right.
We didn't know definitively that there were planets around other stars in the universe. And even at that point in the 60s, planetary science, which is now, the bread and butter of the physical sciences, that was a brand new field. And there was actually a lot of mockery and kind of poo-pooing of early planetary scientists. Carl Sagan has written about this, about how his early ventures into planetary science were met with some pushback. And of course, even just a little bit earlier, prior to that, the idea of spaceflight was seen as kind of a ridiculous thing to go into. There are a couple of really great quotes I think I included later in my book about kind of the mockery of space flight as a pursuit. And so it really does take bravery. And I speak very admiringly about the early SETI pioneers, because the year, even like what Jill was talking about is, and I interviewed Jill for the book as well, so I've talked with her about this at length. It did require a lot of tenacity. Not only because of what we've discussed so far, like the disciplinary boundaries and the cultural challenges, but also just because, you got one life, you're trying to make a career, you're trying to put food on the table, and SETI didn't always seem like the most, the easiest way to do that.
Yeah, it's always funny when people tell us like you're getting paid to hide things, and I'm like, we're not getting paid to do anything. Are you kidding me? I'm driving my several-year-old car and trying to make my mortgage payments. So I
see that as a Cold War historian, kind of primarily. I always find it a little bit funny. The secrets element is because if you learn one thing from the Cold War period, is the Cold War period was a period in which they tried very hard to keep things secret. And they were so bad at it. It's so hard. It's so hard for governments to keep things secret for a long time. And so that take what you want from that. You can either take that optimistically, like, oh, maybe there aren't really we're not hiding the aliens from you. Or you can take it how I take it, which is a little bit nerve-wrackingly like, no one really knows what they're doing. There's no real system in place.
Absolutely. Okay, so Daniela DePaulis, who is one of our SETI Air people, of course, Green Bank, obviously. This is an interesting question. She's asking, how was Carl Sagan collaborating with a Soviet scientist perceived by the scientific community at the time?
That's a great question. Hi, Daniela. It's a great question. So it depends. And it depends on what you mean by the community. Because if you look at the history of science during this period, you will find all sorts. You will find people who really loathed the Soviet Union, right, on the Western side, and worked hard to combat what they believed was kind of this really kind of dual war between ideologies, right? Communism versus democratic capitalism. Bernard Lovell is a great example of this. He there's a section in my book where I talk about this, where Bernard Lovell helped establish the Jodrell Bank Observatory in the UK. It's actually kind of a funny story how he first built the observatory, because he had gotten funds from the University of Manchester and from UK public funds to establish this observatory. And he went way over budget. Like, we're talking the equivalent of today, like millions and millions of pounds over budget, to the point that he was getting investigated for fraud. He might have been put in prison. It was very serious. And this was in 1957 when the telescope was finished. And he was so lucky, because in 1957, that's when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And it turns out that there were no Western telescopes that were capable of tracking not the Sputnik satellite, which anyone, even with like an amateur radio set, could track, the little beep beep sound, but the staged rocket that launched Sputnik. And it was very important to do that, because a staged rocket could be used as an intercontinental missile. It had really, really profound implications for national security and also for the oncoming space race. So he was saved. He didn't go to jail. Jodrell Bank Observatory still exists, but he ended up being really inspired by the use of his infrastructure to be able to play a role in the Cold War. And in fact, he later even co-opted SETI scientists and SETI infrastructure to use their tools to try to help the intelligence community find secret Soviet space links. And so he would have seen collaborating in that sense as maybe irresponsible. But on the other hand, like I said, there were a ton of scientists at the time who really believed, for better or for worse, for right or for wrong, that science was apolitical, that science transcends national boundaries. And so they saw it as something really worth pursuing, not only for the sake of science, but because they believed that was what was right. And that was what science was supposed to be. Now, of course, it's difficult for historians of science, because we, of course, see all of the political interference that happens to science during this time period. So science was not apolitical. In fact, it was highly political during this time period. But just because it was doesn't mean that the scientists didn't feel that way or didn't believe it should be that way. And because of that mentality, that really pushed them to want to collaborate with their peers. So across the history of science, not just astronomy, you see a lot of examples of scientists trying to find sneaky ways to work or collaborate with their colleagues. It's kind of this inverse of the traditional narrative we're taught about kind of the race or the competition, the scientific technical competition with the Soviet Union. So he wouldn't have been alone.
Well, that's good to know, and it makes sense. I cannot imagine it's just so difficult for me to imagine not being able to collaborate, because I've grown up in a time where, you know, we have the internet and we have the capability for this like almost instantaneous interaction, like you and I chatting right now from completely different locations in the world. You know, that's amazing to me, and I could not imagine not being able to have that. So I'm glad to hear that most people at the time would have been like, no, collaborate, do the thing. Shh, do it. Okay, we're way over, and I apologize for keeping you so much longer. It is such a fascinating topic, and there's so many aspects of it that I wish we could sit here and discuss for like the next 2 hours. But I will just say, go read her book when it comes out. If you can get your hands on it sooner, do that, but read her book. I'm going to ask basically 2 more questions.
Sure.
One is from an audience member. Okay, was there anything you really felt you had to lead about because it might have been seen as a security risk?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes. And not a security risk. I obviously can't go into too much detail about what that is, but not a security risk in a, like, I wasn't told by any like government official, don't put something in the book, but more, you know, my last trip to Russia was in 2019. I had a lot of really generous, kind, and wonderful Russian scientists work with me, who were very open and shared a lot of wonderful information with me about what it was like to be a radio astronomer, a SETI scientist during that time. And you know, the situation changed radically between my last trip and where we're at in our relations with Russia today. And I feel like it's my moral responsibility to, you know, protect and respect the people who helped me so much to be able to conduct this research. So I was very mindful of when I was using names or talking about certain projects that I feel like maybe this person shouldn't have shared this, or maybe sharing this particular file they showed me might get them into trouble. I was cognizant of that. And so there are things that I didn't include. But I'm not saying this in a conspiratorial way. It's nothing, there's no secret aliens, but rather just, you know, average people who were, you know, being open and sharing about their lives as scientists during that time, and wanting to be cognizant of the fact that the situation has changed, and you know, not wanting to put their lives at risk. So
more protecting your sources than protecting national security, really.
Yes, yeah.
And that's absolutely reasonable and good journalism, honestly. Finally, what is next for you? Are you going to be recording an audiobook version of this? Are you working on another book? What is the next direction for Rebecca?
Thanks. Well, I recently got a position as a historian at the American Institute of Physics. I'm very excited about that. I was formerly a Jansky Fellow at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. So it's just thrilling to have got such a fantastic job. There are jobs in SETI. I always tell young people, like, you know, the times have changed. The environment, you know, in the SETI world has changed since the Cold War period. And also there are a lot more social SETI jobs. So I consider myself to be a social SETI scientist. I work with my colleagues in anthropology of SETI, sociology of SETI. There are psychologists. So there are jobs in this field. And if anyone ever is curious about that, I welcome you to reach out to me, and I can talk to you about how you might consider pursuing a career in social SETI. And then, yeah, I'm working on another book. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but it is on SETI. And then, yeah, also still working on promoting mixed signals. Too soon to talk about anything, but it might have a media future, potentially. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And yeah, but just continuing my work in SETI research and in the history of physics and astrophysics, and trying to support other people who are doing work in this area.
That's very exciting. Rebecca, thank you again for being here today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. If you're interested in finding out if you can get your hands on Rebecca's book or pre-order it, you can go to the link in our show notes, and we have it linked to her publisher, so you can then follow to the purchaser of your choice. And So again, thank you so much. Good luck with this. I really, really hope that this is a success for you. The buzz has been increasing, so I'm hopeful. And I think one of the things you mentioned is that you got published sooner in the UK than anticipated because of the buzz.
Actually, it's I was published in the UK first, I believe, because it's not typical for publishers to publish books in the autumn of an election year in the US because it's difficult to compete in the news cycle. So I'm not sure January is that much better, but we'll see. Hopefully, I'll manage to get some press coverage.
Well, you've got some here, so make sure everybody that you like and share, comment, do all of the social media things so that we can get Rebecca's information out there. Grab a copy of that book when you have an opportunity, and next we'll have you back when the next book comes out, I am sure. So just kind of keep us in mind and informed. Thank you, everybody. Once again, this is the last SETI Live of 2024. We are done for the year because obviously next week we are closed for the winter holiday, and we will be back on January 9th. It will be me and Frank. For those of you who are always excited to see the two of us natter at each other, we'll be talking about what to expect in 2025. It's become an annual thing, everybody, and we're doing our research now, trying to figure out what we can share with you. So come on back in 3 weeks, and we will be ready to kick off the new year. Rebecca, have a wonderful holiday. Have a happy new year. Everybody, make sure that you stop by SETI.org. Support us by donating, signing up for our newsletter to get our information directly into your inbox, and just, be a part of our mission to communicate, and find. So all of these things are incredibly important, and we're glad you're all here. Have a happy holiday for those of you who celebrate, and we'll see you in 2025. Bye.